I'm not sure if you've noticed, but it's a little hot these days over here in North America anyway. In Canada and the US, especially the northeast US and the eastern Canada provinces, it's pretty hot. And it's getting a little ridiculous. It's only June, and it doesn't usually get this hot in June. We're breaking records upon records upon records, and it doesn't look like there's really an end in sight from what I can see in this heat wave that's putting about 150 million Americans in this heat wave, and certain areas are in danger or having some sort of heat warning. And so this is something that we need to talk about because it seems like, just from an anecdotal point of view, climate change is getting worse and worse and worse every year, or we're feeling it worse and worse every year, especially this year when it's an El Nino year and things are changing. So we've got a couple stories that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about record low sea ice in Hudson Bay that puts polar bears at risk of extinction. And we're also going to be talking about coastal cities in the U.S. that may or may not be there in 100 years, 50 to 100 years or so. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about climate change and how this heat wave has got me thinking. It's probably got a lot of people thinking. I don't know if it has you thinking, but it's definitely got me thinking. And how the heck are we, like, when's the end of this heat wave going to hit? Because it's getting ridiculous outside. For the past week and a half, I feel like it's the past week. I remember last Sunday, not this Sunday that I'm recording on this. Last Sunday, I was talking to my wife. We were out in the backyard, enjoying our backyard. It was a lovely Sunday evening. And it was a little chilly. There was breeze, and it was like, 22 degrees Celsius. I'm going to deal in Celsius because I'm Canadian. And I was like, wow, this is getting really, really hot, or really, really cold. And so let's go inside. So we went inside for a little bit. It was like 9 o'clock, 9:30. And I was like, wow, yeah, it's really cold. I'm surprised. I thought it was going to be really hot this year. And then the next day hit. And oh my Lord, did it ever get hot. I coach football, and we had to alter practices because it was crazy. It even rained in the afternoon, and it got hotter. It got more humid, and that's just insane. And, I started to see this come on in Florida when I had some colleagues from work went to a conference there. And they came back and I said, hey, how was Florida? How was it? Well, the conference went well, but it was 46 degrees Celsius outside. 46 degrees Celsius outside. That is insane. And I was like, wow, and it's only June. I'm like, Florida's going to be hot this year. Like, normally Florida's hot. Even in June, it's hot. And I hear like people who live in Florida, like, oh yeah, summers are crazy. We don't even like being here because it's so darn hot. Okay, but 46 in June, like, what's July gonna be? What's what's August gonna be? I heard friends that live or have family that live in India. They're talking about how it's 50 degrees. It hit 50 degrees a few times last week. That's high. That's really, really hot. And I know these places are used to being hot, but it's getting even hotter outside. And, and when we have, stories like we're going to cover today, like the record low sea ice in Hudson Bay up in Canada, where it's really affecting that sea ice. The heat is melting the sea ice. The Greenland sheets are melting. There's these doomsday ice sheet that's melting as well. We're starting to see hotter water in the ocean. Just in general, I'm not sure if you've seen the meme that's going around, or the satellite imagery of temperatures in the ocean. We're already starting to see, waters up to 100 degree Fahrenheit, which weren't seen before that. Before last year, they weren't seen in a long, long time, and that was only every once in a while. Now we're seeing it more and more. And so they're expecting even a more tumultuous season of hurricanes in the southeast, of the U.S., because the Atlantic is just so hot. We're just going to see much more evaporation. We're going to see much more temperature. And, the sea level rise, because the ice is melting and the water's getting hot, what happens is the ocean just absorbs a lot of that carbon and a lot of that heat. And so it's absorbing the heat. So the water molecules are expanding. So everything is expanding in the ocean. So we're going to start to see an increase in the sea level rise. And in certain areas, it's going to get worse than others, right? Certain areas, you're going to start to see, no change at all. In other areas, you're going to start to see, huge changes. And that just depends on what degrees we're looking at, right? So if we're seeing, the study says the ice-free period too long for southern and western Hudson Bay polar bear populations if global warming exceeds 1.6 or 2.6 degrees Celsius. So that means we're going to see ice-free conditions. Now, here's a little bit about polar bear ecology. Polar bears are a bit of like a canary in the coal mine because they require sea level or sea ice at some point, whether it's fixed or it's floating out in the sea. They require that to rest from their long swims. Polar bears are considered marine mammals because they spend more than 60% of their time in the ocean. So they're considered marine mammals. There have been records that have been broken where a polar bear has swam. I think the longest it's been recorded to swim is 700 kilometers, but it needs to rest during that time, right? Like 700 kilometers is obviously the extreme, but they're looking at 100 or 200 kilometers. They got to go find seals. So what happens in Hudson Bay is every year during the summer, especially early summer, the polar bears come in from wherever they're coming from, and they all aggregate at Hudson's Bay. And that bay, it's a huge bay, and they come in, they're usually around Churchill. There's a huge population that comes in. People know it. They get inside, they hide, and whatever it might be, they stay away from the bears. And then the bears go swimming, and they hop on sea ice to be able either to eat the seals that they catch or pull up the seals that they catch and hunt from there. And even seals will hang out on those sea ice floats, right? But if the water's getting hotter and the temperature's getting hotter, that ice is not going to be there. That sea ice, that floating sea ice, is not going to be there. It's going to melt. And if you don't have those floating sea ice, areas, then polar bears are just going to drown because they need to breathe water and they can't just float on their own. They need to swim. And so if they're not swimming, then they are drowning. And if they don't have anything to rest on, they are drowning. And we're going to start to see less and less and less polar bears around. Now, polar bears all have they have other troubles as well. They have troubles with their fur from the air quality that comes up from the south and comes into it kind of gets taken in by their body and it goes into their fur. So they have chemicals in their fur. I remember doing an interview about polar bears a long time ago with somebody who worked with Polar Bears International. And so they already have their own problems, right? The scarcity of food, not only at sea, but on ice, on land as well, is getting worse and worse. So you're starting to see polar bears travel more. That means they're going to be skinnier. They're not going to be as healthy. And they're probably going to get the first thing they can get, which is not what they want and probably not the healthiest for them. So apparently Hudson Bay has warmed over 1 degree Celsius in the last 30 years. Coincident with this warming, seasonal patterns have shifted, with the spring ice melting earlier and the fall freeze-up occurring later, leading to a month longer of ice-free conditions. This extended ice-free period presents a significant challenge for polar bears as it restricts their hunting opportunities for seals and their ability to accumulate the necessary body weight for successful reproduction. That was in that latest paper that I'm talking about here. Right, so this is a problem for this lack of sea ice and for polar bears. And you're probably wondering, it's polar bears. Yes, we want to protect the polar bears, but they're an endangered species anyway. When push comes to shove, we need to protect humans. The humans are the ones that are at stake here. And if we lose polar bears, I'm sure, even though I think it's awful, I'm sure some people will be like, yeah, if we lose polar bears, that's not going to be good. That's not going to be good at all. Well, then I found this article that I just came by, and I don't normally like to do episodes on climate change because they can be depressing, right? Because there's not a lot of quick changes that we can do. I mean, politically there is, but that's not going to happen, right? We just don't see quick policies that get put into place that can help us and then, help us go in reverse of this climate change. No, it takes a lot more, and I'm not sure if we'll see that. There are a couple ideas which we'll go over in just a second. But there's an article from the cooldown.com, and it talks about scientists sound the alarm as growing threats loom over coastal states. Here's what you need to know. So along the coast, the damage would be extensive. Now, 60% of the population around the world live along the coast, and that's true for the U.S. and for Canada. We need to live around some sort of water body because it's important for us to get certain things in. Back in the day, it was important for food. It was an important pathway to get materials in for trade and so forth. And it still is. It's still a big part of our society. But when you're near water and you're in a state where climate change is really affecting the world, you're seeing sea level rise. And just like I mentioned earlier, as the water expands because it's absorbing heat, and we're seeing more water put into the ocean because of melting sea ice, we're going to start to see rising sea levels. And they're a concern in many places worldwide, from islands in the Southwest Pacific to canal-based cities in Venice and Italy. And in the United States, many coastal areas are preparing for this situation. And the NOAA has shared an interactive map, which I'll share the link in the show notes, of how each country would look after sea level rise as much as 10 feet. So this one here was more of the states in the ocean. So essentially what it is, it's like, okay, if you have 10 feet of sea level rise in certain areas, this is what the country's going to look like. And if you zoom in to certain areas, so for instance, if I zoom in to areas like Miami, which is a big city, and then, I always find it interesting, it's a big city that people like to go to. If you look on social media and you look at sort of like the cool kids of social media, the people who have a lot of money, they fly into and out of Miami quite a bit. Miami is that city. It's a party city. It's where a lot of the rich go. They build their homes. And you just see all this happen. Well, if you take that toggle and you go down the water level and you go down to like 1 foot, right, or 0 feet, and you go to 1 foot, well, you're looking at a lot of Miami potentially underwater, right? If I look at Miami, it's obviously in that whole area, right? And I start looking, and it's 1 feet. It's not all underwater, but there's a lot of places that are affected. If you just take that toggle and you move up 1 foot, a lot of the area is taken up, like Coulter Bay, Palmetto Bay, like those areas. There's a lot of stuff along the coastline that, like a lot of the infrastructure along the piers, that are going to be gone. And a lot of like lowlands that are going to be gone. And like Biscayne Key or Key Biscayne, we're seeing some areas there. If you go to 2 feet, I start to see like some of the proper, like the city proper, get swallowed up by water. And those islands, those intercoastal islands, Miami Beach and everything like that, that's starting to get taken up, right? And so like streets are flooded with just a 2 foot rise. Then you get into the 3 foot rise, and the 3 foot rise looks big, especially around Miami Beach, South Beach, and things like that. You're starting to see a lot more effect of sea level rise, right? And so if you're starting, and even along like the Everglades and so forth, if I start taking off, the Everglades are starting at 3 feet, are really starting to get impeded by ocean levels, right? And so we're continuing to see all this happen along that coast. Miami Beach, Bay Harbor Island, Sunny Isle beaches, all those outer coastal like highways and outer coastal areas, intercoastal areas, those are all like, they're practically gone. That's just with 3 feet. And you start to go with 4 feet. Now you're starting to look at the rivers expand within the city. And you're starting to see Miami just sort of disappear and disappear. Then it gets like 5 feet gets really bad. Like the city's flooded in a lot of areas, right? And so like you see this happen, and it's this is something that you've got. It's a problem, right? All the low-lying areas expand, right? And then you start to see like the water depth deepen in certain areas. And then a lot of it's from rivers. In some places you don't even expect it. And I talked about it in an episode a while ago where, the water's coming from the ground. It's coming up because there's nowhere for anything to absorb because the water's seeping in underneath. And so we're going to start to see areas where it's like, how did this get flooded? And that's because it's all coming up from the ground. So there's a lot more low-lying areas in Miami and things like that. It can get, like, Florida's going to get pretty bad. We're going to start to see like Louisiana, and at 5 feet, Louisiana is pretty much like any of those coastal areas are pretty much gone. New Orleans, hey, Tragically Hip said it's sinking. Yeah, it's pretty much sunk, right? Because of Lake Pontchartrain and everything. It's not good. A lot of the places are gone or become islands, and that's not good. And let's look up north to like areas of my way. You're looking at, let's see how areas in like Lake Ontario. I don't know if they have it for Lake Ontario. They probably don't have it for Lake Ontario. No, they don't have it for the Great Lakes, unfortunately. But they do have it for like New York City, right? They have it for New York City, and you're seeing a lot of places in New York City, flooded. A lot of the pier areas and everything, those are flooded. So, we are not in good shape, folks, with this increase. And so we have to start thinking about, what is going to happen to these areas. So a rise of 2 feet, if we want to just kind of put it in context, a rise of 2 feet would put coastal states all the way up to the east and west coast, as well as Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama at risk. Oregon is one state that would see a major impact. So as Oregon Live detailed, a 6-foot rise will submerge islands in the Columbia River, potentially completely covering the Sauvie Island. Right, that's pretty good. So like pretty bad. So like, why is this really concerning? It's because high water levels, first and foremost, put coastal communities at risk of severe flooding. So this could destroy homes and businesses, make some areas unlivable, and put citizens in danger. Right. It says among the other major effects of sea level rise, if sea level rises, are an increased possibility of extreme weather events, land loss, and coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, and freshwater contamination, and climate mitigation or climate migration, as detailed in the National Resource Defense Council. So here's the thing: is like we see these maps and we're like, oh, it's not that bad. It's not going to be permanent in certain areas. But the problem is it gets more and more vulnerable. Your city becomes more and more vulnerable as more water creeps in. So when you do have hurricanes, say in Florida, the flooding becomes worse. The flooding starts to reach areas that it never reached before in the last 30 years. And so that becomes a problem. We're going to start to see people move. But when people move, they have to sell their homes. Well, who's going to buy a home that's going to be flooded every time there's a bit of a storm? Right? As I mentioned last time, the rich will be able to kind of sort of write it off or get rid of it without having to buy a new place, because they can buy a new place anywhere they want. But for those of the people in Florida who can't, or in areas that have low-lying areas who can't afford to go, well, they're not going to be able to just not sell a house and just buy a house. They're going to have to start all over again. And houses are going to be more expensive, and there's going to be certain areas that they have to go and see, and they have to go in, and they have to buy, and it's just going to be really difficult. We're going to see a huge climate migration in the U.S. and probably Canada as well. So a lot of these things, it will happen over time. As we are starting to see, like I remember 20 years ago, my supervisor and I talking about climate change, and he was like, you know what, it's going to get ignored and people are just going to go on their regular day. But when they go on their regular day and we start to see more of these changes actually happen, they're going to compound on each other. It's going to be like compound interest. It's going to be a compounding climate change effect. And we're going to get worse and worse and worse. And it's going to be at a much faster rate. And that's what we're going to see. And that's what we're starting to see right now. Right? It's not just wildfires that we're seeing every once in a while. It's wildfires every year. And now they don't even stop. They go all the way around the clock, all the way around the year, even when it's cold in some areas. Most of the boreal forest was on fire at some point in Canada. We have a huge boreal forest, one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. And most of it was on fire. And it burned down homes. It put people out. It killed people. This is all because of climate change. And this has been happening along the West Coast for a longer time than just last year, but it's getting worse and worse. It's not getting better. And it's not going to get better. And unfortunately, we still have people who fight this and says, oh, well, it's lightning or people are setting fires. Well, it's not true. Right? Lightning will happen. As things get drier and drier, lightning will continue to spark these fires. But they're saying it's arsonists. And it could be an arsonist, doing a little part, but it gets really big because everything is just so dry. So dry. But they're not responsible. Arsonists are not responsible for setting every single fire that's happened in Canada over the last year and a half. Right? Or in the US. So we're starting to see worse extreme events. They're starting to happen more frequently. And they're not going to stop until we decide to do something. And that really comes down to political pressure. And I'll be honest, in North America, in Canada and the US, we have elections coming up. The U.S. has a major federal election coming up in 2024 this year in November, and Canada has one in October of 2025. And there are major decisions to be made here. In both situations, you have one party, and it's pretty much a two-party race for each one. You have one party who's doing something about climate change, and then you have another party who doesn't want to do anything about climate change. You have to identify which one's going to do the most and which one's going to do something. But if we elect the wrong ones, right, they're not going to do anything. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And their friends in the fossil fuel industry are going to get richer and richer and richer. And that's really what it comes down to. We can do everything we want individually, but when it comes to elections, a big federal election like we have in Canada and we have in the US this year, it really is going to matter. We do have to put money, we have to dedicate policy to climate change, and we have to do it faster than ever. Because if we don't do it, we are in bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger trouble every single year. And so these stories just highlight some of the consequences we're seeing from sea level rise and from a heating planet. We need to do more. We need to do something. And it really comes down to an election. Now, I know a lot of the times, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. That's none of my business. I know who I'm voting for at this point in time for the Canadian election, but I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. You have values, you have beliefs in certain things, and that's fine. But what I am telling you is to be on the lookout and see which party has the policies to fight climate change. You may not agree with each and every one of them, but do they have the policies? And what does the other party have? Do they have nothing? Or is there's one of the party's policies in Canada is like, hey, there's carbon capture. We can rely on carbon capture. Not right now. There have been studies that have come out saying carbon capture is not part of climate change mitigation at this point because it does not work the way we want it to. That's a big problem. It's not there yet. It might get there at one point, but it's not there yet. So we cannot, as the fossil fuel companies have been saying, we can continue to burn fossil fuels because we are going to capture each one. So it'll come out a wash every time we do it. No, that's not true. It will not come out a wash. It will be worse. And it's not going to help. So you got to just do your homework. You got to start looking at the science. You got to start talking. You got to start listening to people, what they're saying. And if somebody comes off and says, hey, climate change is not that bad, we should be okay, or they say it's too bad that we can't do anything about it, none of those are true. We can do something about it. We need to do something about it. We need to do something about it fast. And because things are getting a little hairy. Things are getting a little wet, let's just say, no pun intended, but things are getting a little wet. And so we need to do something more about it. And that requires electing the right party that will actually do something about climate change. I wish both parties would offer up different ideas on how to do climate change so we can make a better decision. But at this point right now, it seems to be, from what I've seen, for both countries and all the parties running, there seems to be one party has a climate action plan, the other party doesn't. And if you can prove me wrong, that would be great. I would love to see it, but I would love that choice to say, hey, I want to vote for this party because I like their climate action plan better. Not because, hey, I'm not voting for this party because it doesn't have a climate action plan. That's the disappointing part about some of these parties that are running and some of these leaders that are trying to run them. So anyway, that's it for today's episode. I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is going to happen if the next governments get in? Do you think we can still do this? What kind of policies do you like best in your country that fights climate change? And if you're part of a country that doesn't fight climate change, what policies are the opposition putting forward? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. And if you want more news to your inbox Monday to Friday, you can get that if you go to speakupforblue.com/newsletter and sign up for our newsletter for free. All you have to do is just put in your email. I don't sell it to anybody. I don't give it to anybody. It stays as private as my software allows it to. And you get information to your inbox every single day, Monday to Friday. So thank you again for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. This has been a great time. I really like talking about this stuff, although it's depressing, but I appreciate you sharing the episode for anybody who needs to know more about climate change and the ocean. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.